Well, welcome to this week's Walk Through Voices. I hope that you are reading through the Bible with us this year. If you're following along in the daily walk reading schedule, you know that this week we are reading from 1 Samuel chapter 20 to 2 Samuel chapter 10. 1 Samuel chapter 20 to 2 Samuel chapter 10. In the section that we're reading together, Saul is king. Remember, the people came to God and said, "Give us a king. We want to be like all the other nations." And God said, "I'm not sure you're going to like that, but here you go." And he gave him a king. That first king's name was Saul, and Saul really had no heart for serving God. And David was selected to be the next king of God's people long before Saul's death. And so Saul had this growing bitterness and jealousy towards David. And so much of the chapters that we are reading in 1 Samuel chapter 20 through the end of the book and into 2 Samuel is this pursuit that Saul has after David. David is running. David knows that Saul wants to kill him, and so David is on the run. He's fleeing for safety, and Saul is just unrelenting in his pursuit after David. You know, in many ways, these are hard chapters to read. They're chapters that are filled with killing and murder and violence and death, and it's sometimes hard to read these chapters and step back and say, God, what are you trying to teach me in these chapters? How do we apply this portion of the Bible to our life? And so they can be difficult chapters to read. But as I read through this week's reading again, there was something that struck me in a pretty profound way. It's actually something that happened twice in these chapters that we're reading together this week. First in 1 Samuel chapter 24, and then again in 1 Samuel chapter 26. David was running from Saul, who was trying to kill him. Saul was in pursuit. David had found a cave and went and hid in a cave with some of the men that he had gathered around him. And he's hiding in this cave, and there's this really interesting verse, chapter 24 of 1 Samuel, verse 3. It says, he came to the sheep pens along the way, and a cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself, which is an interesting verse. But that's the same cave that David was hiding in. As it says, verse 3, David and his men were far back in the cave. The men said, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish." Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off the corner of Saul's robe. Verse 5, afterward David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." With these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went on his way. And what an interesting scene. David has been running for his life, and he's hiding in a cave, and Saul comes in to relieve himself, the text says. And David's friends who have gathered with him said, here's your chance. Go take matters into your own hands. Go sneak in the darkness and take care of this man Saul who's been after you. A couple of chapters later, in 1 Samuel chapter 26, Saul and his army are camped and they're all asleep. And David sees the army and he sees where they are and he sees that they're all sleeping. And so him and one other go down into the camp in 1 Samuel chapter 26, verse 7. So David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there was Saul lying asleep inside the camp with his spear stuck in the ground near his head. Abner and the soldiers were lying around him. And Abishai said to David, "Today God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Now let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I won't strike him twice." But David said to Abishai, "Don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? As surely as the Lord lives," he said, "the Lord himself will strike him, or his time will come and he will die, or will go into battle and perish. But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. Now get the spear and the water jug that are near his head, and let's go." It's another very similar incident to what we see in chapter 24. David had a unique opportunity to find Saul and to end this pursuit, and yet he restrained and wouldn't go against God's instruction. You know, David's life had just been completely upended by Saul's pursuits. I mean, he was on the run, fleeing for his life, knowing that at any moment his life was in danger or in jeopardy. And even by modern sensibilities, for David to have taken matters into his own hands, to provide some self-defense for himself, and to take out Saul would have probably been judged as expected or okay or acceptable. But David was willing to trust in God's provision for his life, God's care for his life, rather than to take matters into his own hands, rather than to take an easy way out. David was willing to wait and to trust. And that just got me thinking as I was reading these chapters in 1 Samuel. Are there areas of our life where we're tempted to run ahead of God's plan, to run faster than how God is at work, to take matters into our own hands, to do what's easy and sensible rather than to wait and trust? Here's what I was reminded of as I read 1 Samuel 20 through 2 Samuel 10 this week. God always sees and God always blesses our faithfulness to trust Him more than we trust in ourselves, more than when we trust in taking matters into our own hands, more than when we try to take the easy way out. Even when it doesn't make sense, even when it's hard and difficult, trusting in God's plan is always, always better. God bless.